Hey, I'm Christina Kent, an artist based out of San Francisco. I mostly do oil paintings, and I focus on subjects including landscapes, cityscapes, portraits, and still lifes. And today I'm super excited to walk you through my process for doing a still life painting. Still life painting is a great practice for both experienced painters and beginners alike. I love it because you can do it right at home. Still life paintings are a simple way to practice drawing, color, and composition. And doing a painting directly from life is a great way to train your artist's eye. For this painting, I'm going to be using the introductory oil set from Gamblin. This is a great set of professional oil paints. It has a variety of colors that makes it great for painting virtually any subject. Oil painting can be intimidating at first, so if you're a beginner, I hope that I can demystify the process with this still life painting. So for this still life, I'm going to be using this set of professional artist oil colors from Gamblin. It's a really nice introductory set. I also have this primed panel from Blick. And for the brushes, I'm using Princeton Summit Series brushes in the number 4 flat size. I also have a little cardboard viewfinder that I made. And I have Gamsol for thinning the paint and cleaning my brushes. And then just a little jar for cleaning my brushes with the Gamsol. For my still life setup, I like to have a variety of fruit to choose from. It can also be helpful to have different colored papers to put under the fruit to use for your composition. And then I like to have some sort of lamp or light source for lighting the still life. The first step in the painting process is to tone the panel. I'm using the burnt umber paint here, and I just get a little bit of Gamsol on my brush and use that to put a very thin layer of paint onto the panel. I like to tone my panels before painting because it gives me a neutral ground to start painting on rather than the bright white of the primed panels. If you put too much paint on the panel and it's a little too dark, you can always wipe off the excess with a paper towel. Now we can let the panel dry for at least 24 hours. Next, it's time to set up a still life. For beginners, I recommend starting with something simple like an orange on a piece of paper. If you like, you can also experiment with changing the color of the paper underneath. You'll notice as you change the color of the papers underneath, then it'll change how the colors in the composition look relative to one another. For my still lifes, I like to cut the fruit up into pieces so that I have a variety of shapes and some interesting shadows for my composition. I like to take some time to experiment, to try out different compositions. I'll move the pieces around until I find a composition that looks interesting. I also like to use a viewfinder like this to decide how I want to crop the composition and what I want to include in my painting. Here's the final composition I decided on. You'll notice it has a variety of shapes, shadows, and colors. Now it's time to get to painting. I start with sketching out the basic shapes of the composition. I use ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and cadmium yellow light to make a deep brownish purple. I use this dark mixture to draw the basic shapes that I see in my composition. At this stage, I'm sketching very lightly with the paint, using only a small amount. That way, the drawing lines I put down in this stage won't mix with the subsequent layers of color. I draw in darker lines as I become more confident of the placement of all of the shapes in the composition. Once I've got the basic shapes drawn out, then I start to add color. I usually like to start with my darker shadows. Here I'm using alizarin crimson, cadmium red, ultramarine blue, and cadmium yellow light to create a really deep, dark orange. This is a stage I like to call the block-in stage. It's when I'm filling in the shapes I've sketched in with big blocks of strong color. In this stage, I'm less focused with getting all the details right and more focused on making sure that the color relationships are correct. Once I've added the darkest parts of the oranges, I start to mix a slightly lighter color for the parts of the oranges that are getting hit by direct light. This is the part of the composition where I see the brightest, most saturated color. Next, I focus on the shadows being cast by the oranges. For these, I mix a slightly dull purple color. I notice some parts of the shadow are lighter than others, so I adjust my mixture accordingly. Throughout this process, I'm looking closely at my still life again and again to make sure that I'm getting the colors right. Sometimes I'm surprised by the colors I see. For example, I usually think of the pith of the orange as white, but when it's in shadow, like in this case, sometimes it actually starts to appear green. After blocking in all the sections in shadow, then I turn to the highlights. I usually like to err on the side of making the highlights a little bit darker than they need to be. That's because when you're painting with wet paint on wet paint in oil painting like I'm doing here, it's a lot easier to layer a lighter color on top of a dark color than to go the other way. I start filling in the background and I can finally see all of the colors starting to work together. Even though the background is a solid white sheet of color, I'm careful not to put it all in as the exact same shade because some parts of the background are closer to the light and other parts are further away, and that causes subtle shifts in color and hue. As I paint in the background, I'm also redefining some of the shapes that I created earlier to make them more accurate to what I'm seeing. After I've put in the background, I notice that the oranges themselves are looking a little dark, and so I go to brighten up the colors in the oranges. I build layers of lighter color onto the darker colors that I've already established to create a sense of brightness. At this stage, I'm almost done with this still life painting, and I also start to fine-tune some of the smaller details. I lightly use my brush to soften some of the edges between shapes, and also add some highlights for finishing touches. After adding the final details, I've brought the painting to a pretty good finish and I'm ready to call it a day. Here's the final result. I hope you enjoyed this still life painting process and that it gave you some inspiration for your own art. Happy painting!